and thank you for your engagement and support of the Foreign Policy Association. It is really an honor and a privilege for me to introduce John Taylor, my friend. As chairman of the Foreign Policy Association board, as a trustee at the university, at Stanford University, as an overseer of Hoover Institution, and as the father of a student of John Taylor in economics at Stanford, you can only imagine how much of a pleasure it is for me to be introducing John. John is a larger-than-life figure, towering significantly in the world of macroeconomics, monetary economics, international economics, all in academia, in policy, and in governance of all these institutions and in all these matters. John is a preeminent authority in the role of central banks around the world, and his advice and counsel is sought by many countries and many government officials, many policymakers, and many students that want to learn what is the right and proper role of monetary policy and their execution people in the central banks around the world. John has a pedigree that few of us can even imagine. In trying to research a lot, as to all the various areas that John has contributed, I was completely awed in all the things that he has been acting and involved in. As an academician, John is currently a professor of economics at Stanford University, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and has held numerous positions in various centers and institutes at Stanford, in addition to having been a professor at great universities such as Princeton and Columbia universities. He has held a number of teaching awards. He is extremely popular among the students at Stanford, highly sought of, and I can witness that in my position as a Stanford alumnus and trustee and the father of a student and all his friends. All of them want to take John Taylor in economics, not only because of his knowledge, his experience, but his incredible and admirable way of teaching the subject matters. In academic governance and administration, John is a kingmaker, being sought constantly to serve on the various search committees for the various leaders of various departments and institutes at Stanford University. I have been witness to many of those requests and see him in action in that capacity. As a policymaker, John has served in a number of capacities and a number of times in various positions in the US Treasury, the President's Council of Economic Advisors, the Congressional Budget Office, and many other institutions in the US and around the world. Noteworthy was his position as US Treasury Undersecretary for International Affairs in the years right around and after 9/11, a period of time of tremendous volatility in markets and in the world as a whole. Also noteworthy was John's position as one of the finalists in the selection to be Fed chair a few years ago. I don't know if that was a blessing that he didn't get selected or not, but for sure, John would have added a huge amount of energy, stamina to that position, but continues to do so as an advisor to many of the policymakers at the Federal Reserve. As an author, you can only imagine how many pages you have to go through to see the various books that John has authored, the number of articles that he has published or comments or reviews. I counted over 15 pages of listings in all of that. And as an editor, he's been involved in about a dozen publications in economics journals of all types. It is clear to me, and hopefully to all of you, that the world today would not be the same without John Taylor. He clearly has made a huge difference in the world in which we live in, and we're thankful to his contributions and continued success. We're gonna hear from John for a period of time on his prepared remarks. And after that, my good friend and fellow board member of the FPA, Tom Mitchell, will have a fireside, quotes, discussion with John Taylor. Welcome to both of you, and join me in thanking John for being part of this series.
Thank you so much, Henry, for your generous and kind introduction. It's an honor for me to be here to give the Peterson lecture on national security and fiscal policy. And Henry, thank you for being a trustee at Stanford and overseer at Hoover and so many other things. And I look forward to interacting with Tom Rashad as well. I just noticed that the Foreign Policy Association came out with a new book, America and the World in 2020. It's quite good. I have a little short essay on it. So let me start by mentioning a former deliverer of the Peterson lecture. It was the inaugural lecture. It was given by Paul O'Neill, a good friend, back in 2016. Paul was the Secretary of the Treasury when I worked at the Treasury. We worked together quite a bit. And Pete Peterson was in the audience when Paul gave his talk in 2016. Paul focused on the deficit a lot. And he learned from Pete about that, the importance of fiscal policy and deficit, and I learned from Paul. So there's a similarity here of thinking, which I think I'll stress as I get into this discussion. I also note that last year, my good friend John Lipsky gave the Peterson lecture. And he wondered, I think in a quite creative way, how long the economic expansion would be continuing. That was back in November of last year. Well, it turned out to be not so long, but for reasons neither John nor anyone else could possibly have forecast back then. What a different world we're in now. You know, I like the idea of combining national security and fiscal policy, which is the theme of this lecture series. A few years ago, George Shultz, my colleague at Stanford at Hoover, he edited a book called Blueprint for America. And by the way, George gave the Ethel LeFranc Distinguished Lecture at the Foreign Policy Association just about 10 years ago. It was about a book he wrote 10 years ago called Ideas and Action. Ideas and Action, what a wonderful theme. In any case, in the Blueprint for America book, there's a chapter by Admiral Ellis, Secretary Mattis, who's out at Stanford Hoover now, Corey Shockey, who's the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy at AEI. And they had an essay which was worrying that national security was becoming too unfocused. And they argued that what we needed was a strategy of security and solvency, that's in quotes, security and solvency. And what they were trying to show is that economic policy is really integral to military and diplomatic power. They noted that, and I quote, no country has ever retained its military power when its economic foundation has faltered. And I think of this as something that's been guided me in government and elsewhere over the years. And that is, we need to think about three aspects of our foreign policy: the economics, the diplomacy, and the military. And of course, in the US, that means the departments of state, defense, and of course, don't forget the Treasury. So let me start with economic policy and fiscal policy as in the theme of these essays, of these talks. In response to the coronavirus pandemic, of course, federal spending in the US as a share of GDP has gone up tremendously, 20% to 30% just in 2020. Projections of CBO&L say that it's going to come down again, at least temporarily, in the next few years, but then it's going to start to rise again up to 30%, a huge amount. I think it's useful to think about an alternative fiscal policy, a fiscal consolidation plan, and I think it's needed. And I think this could be put in place at the same time the next stimulus package, whenever that occurs, we're not sure at this point, whenever it's agreed to. One idea I like is to hold federal expenditures as a share of GDP to the 20% ratio that prevailed before this pandemic hit. That would have spending restraint and avoid potentially large increases in taxes and the debt, which I think is important to think about at this point. Now, we've analyzed such policies and work with John Cogan and Danny Heel, and we've looked at policies that reduce the growth of federal spending, again, after the pandemic, but maintain the federal tax rates at the current levels and limit outstanding federal debt relative to GDP as a result. And the reductions in spending come exclusively from permanent changes in entitlement programs, which are growing very rapidly. There's no impact on defense and non-defense. Basically, they're held harmless, if you like, to keep growing at the same rate of GDP. Now, to be sure, we wanted this plan to come in place after COVID, basically start in 2022, after the impacts of the virus, for the most part, we hope has passed. But in 2033, that's 10 years after that, federal spending will have declined as a share of GDP as a result of this, and lower than the CBO has forecast. And in 20 years, it would be 5.7% below. So these model simulations that I've done, and I think it's important to have a model, economists need models to work with. But this model, it's kind of forward-looking. It takes into account people's expectations of the future, impacts of government spending and taxes and regulations. And it has various rigidities. It's not really something that jumps around quickly. It has rigidities which are natural. There are adjustment costs. But in any case, the impact of such a consolidation plan, it's basically forward-looking outside of the current situation we have, is a substantial increase in real GDP compared to what would otherwise be happening. And that lasts for quite a while, as long as the policy is held in place. It boosts GDP growth substantially. And the reason it does this is, the reason why output rises so much, GDP rises, is that consumption rises quite a bit. And consumption increased basically immediately as this thing gets started, because people realize that they're not going to have higher taxes, going to have more after-tax income to spend. And this offsets any other possible demand side effects that such a policy could have, and which people always worry about naturally. So to be sure, consumption rises, investment in the short run decreases a little bit, but it eventually turns around. The positive effects on consumption are bolstered by net exports because the dollar depreciates a bit. But it's also important to note, and this is relative to the national security question, the overall impacts in other countries are also positive, but of course smaller than the US. So these model calculations, and they do convey a lot of what we know about economics, have this fiscal consolidation plan increasing economic growth. And I think that's important. What I think's crucial in this whole discussion, which we're having now, fiscal policy and national security, is that we need this kind of analysis to be thought about and considered in Washington at this point. As Congress debates alternative fiscal policies, they should be thinking about a plan to really get back to something more normal. This finding is robust, doesn't depend on any one particular model. And I would say a plan is robust, which restrains entitlement spending, restrains it, doesn't cut it, of course. It will avoid an increase in taxes and produce this boost to GDP, which is very important for our national security and our well-being in any case. Now, when you think about fiscal policy, you also think about tax policy. So this proposal does not increase taxes. In fact, the corporate tax rate remains at 21%, which is where it was brought to in 2017, down from 35%. It also keeps reduced tax rates on small businesses, individuals, that would stay. And in fact, what I think is interesting, if you look at the impact of those changes in the 2017 Act, and you stop before the pandemic, which of course has thrown everything a culture, you find this has positive effects. And so I say there's evidence, this is in the data, it's not a model. that productivity growth has increased. And productivity, output per hour, how much each worker can produce on average, is key for driving up incomes and wages. So in any case, productivity growth has doubled from about 0.8% per year from 2013 to 2016 to 1.5% per year in the years since then. So it looks like it's having some effect. And you have to think of tax policy as well as the budget policy when you consider fiscal policy. I think it's very important. Now, when you think about fiscal policy, you also have to think about monetary policy. And Henry Fernandez in his introduction indicated this is an area which I have great interest in, and I do. But I think it would be important for the Fed also to begin thinking about strategy again. They had to deal with the onslaught of the pandemic, which is understandable back in March and April and May. Those were emergency actions. But the changes they put in place in the last couple of months have been a little vaguer, I think, than necessary, a little less specific than is normally the case. So as part of this strategy of economics, I'd like to see the Fed begin to say that it's getting back to the path that it was on beforehand. And there's a question about when to do that and how to do that. That's great. We always have disagreements, but at least have some discussion and description about what they're going to do. And I like to think of this as a rules-based policy. Rules are important in many parts of activity, including international. But a rules-based policy is a way to convey to people what the strategy is going forward. So I'd like to see that as part of the overall economic policy. Then, of course, there's regulatory policy. I've been really struck, I think, as we all have been, about how the private sector has responded in remarkable ways to the pandemic, to the health restrictions, et cetera. This quarter, I'm giving a course to 350 students at Stanford. It's all online, it's all virtual. They're all over the world. It's just amazing. You mainly have to worry about time zones. You're talking at a completely inappropriate time zone, 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning. But I think it's important that we're doing this. Of course, it's thanks to Zoom and Zoom technologies and Eric Yuan, not too far from where I live in California. Facebook will have half its of employees working remotely in the future. Online retail is booming. And I think at this point, the policy needs to be consistent, if you like, with this, to be encouraging it. And there's examples. In California, there's something called AB5, which restricted the amount of work that Uber and Lyft drivers can do. And on the ballot this year, there's something called Proposition 22, and we can debate the merits of all of these. But in this one, there's a sort of relaxation of the regulations to allow people who need to work a few hours a week to do so. And I think that's something that should be taken into account in this terrible pandemic. Also, in terms of regulation, there's, of course, lots of occupational licensing. It's higher in certain parts of the country than in others. But this is the time to be rethinking those because the economy is changing. It's not going to be the same by any means, whether it's education or technical services or retail service, not going to be the same. And we need to take that into account when we think about economic policy. So then there's also trade policy. Trade is part of economics, and it's also part of international. It's very key to our national security policy. Part of the recent issues in trade policy have been to try to get, for the US, to try to get other countries to reduce their tariffs and restrictions. It used to be we would have these reciprocal agreements and everybody would agree to reduce their tariffs by a certain amount. That's harder to do when certain countries have more barriers than you do. So these negotiations have been ongoing, and I'm hopefully that they're going to be working consistently. I think the goal should be lower tariffs. The goal should be free trade. Getting there is difficult, and that's, I think, what we're going through now. But let's not forget the goals. The other thing that's important from an international perspective, and it relates to national security, is the supply chains. There's been concerns about certain key pharmaceuticals or ingredients or minerals being produced in other countries and the security problems that raises. And it does raise security problems. But it's really not a completely new thing in economics. It's not a completely new idea. I remember one stint in government, there was a complaint that we shouldn't be producing textiles in other parts of the world. All the textiles should be produced in the United States, because what if there was a war and the military had to get their materials elsewhere and we weren't producing it? And that would be a terrible thing. And of course it would be, but there's ways to deal with that. There's some stockpiles, and you can have stockpiles and still have textiles made elsewhere and still benefit from that advantage, comparative advantage that other countries might have, and still maintain the security. Now that's more difficult, to be sure, in the case of pharmaceuticals. The technology is different, and there is maybe more of an extent to which the supply chain needs to be looked at going forward. So these are some of the things that I've been thinking about, in which there's a relationship between fiscal policy, broadly speaking now, thinking of all economic policy, and our national security. So what I've been trying to do in these examples is really show, first of all, why sound fiscal policy, and it's not unusual. It's a kind of fiscal policy that, as I mentioned, Peterson talked about, Paul O'Neill talked about, John Lipsey talked about earlier in this lecture series. It's one that many of us have worked for, including George Shultz, who I mentioned before. So let's not forget that. Let's not think it's a new world. We don't have to worry about deficits anymore. There was a big deficit, $1 trillion before the pandemic began. It's going to be larger now, of course, but eventually it can come down. And I think it would be beneficial, if it does come down, beneficial to all people. And the other thing is, when you think about fiscal policy, think about it in a broader sense. The corollaries are other kinds of economic policy, tax policy. So let's have a tax policy that's conducive to higher economic growth and to higher incomes for everybody. Regulatory policy, the same thing. Let's not stifle innovation. Let's encourage innovation, encourage ways that people can produce more in a better way. Trade policies are essential for our national security. And here I would just emphasize, there's many other examples of this where we can improve things. The COVID-19, the coronavirus, the shelter in place, all those things, the policy responses, they have revealed disparities in the United States, which we maybe should have known more about. And some of them are racial. Some of them are people who are disadvantaged and live in areas which are not as protected, maybe by their jobs. Now, these have national security implications too. We can't forget that. And I think the policy, the responses, the actions that are taken need to be cognizant of this. I think in this case, the reforms and the policy changes may have to be a little deeper. I've been struck by say in the state of California or in other states, where certain sectors have not fared as well as others. And to some extent, that's because they're in areas which are disadvantaged. So I'd like to see basic reforms. They may be very fundamental, the things that we don't always talk about, but we do talk about sometimes. And for example, in the case of income disparities, I think we can do better on our education system, K-12 especially, in certain parts of the United States. I actually enjoyed reading a book recently by my colleague Tom Sowell at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And he wrote a book that's actually largely about New York, about the charter school movement in New York. It's called Charter Schools and Their Enemies. It was written before the COVID-19 epidemic, and he has some good examples of how people are being served well, not every time, but in general, by these kinds of alternative reforms. So I think we should be looking more broadly at ways in which economic policy, I'm using fiscal policy in the broadest sense of the word, can be part of what we need to do, can be helping, if you like, with our national security. But the main point of my remarks, and whether the example starts with the reducing the budget deficit eventually with tax reform, keeping the tax reform we have, with monetary policy reform, with regulatory policy reform, with trade policy reform, all through this is the point is that we should think about economics, diplomacy, and national security in a way that they go together. In one of my stints in government was after 9/11. And I went to many meetings in the White House Situation Room thinking about policy. And I was representing the economic view for the most part. I was Under Secretary of the Treasury for International Affairs. And my colleagues were frequently from the State Department or from the Defense Department, key issues at that point, especially, they still are. But I tried to make a point each meeting to say a little bit about, don't forget the economics, don't forget about the success of people in other parts of the world. And I think it became harder, but because it tends to be a little bit tuned out. It's not as emergency as defense or even diplomacy. It's a little slower moving. And that's why I think we have to pay so much more attention to it and work at it and keep at it. That's been my experience. And I want to continue that. But in a way, it's a way for me to conclude and emphasize why it's so nice. And I am so grateful to be given this Peter G. Peterson lecture on national security and fiscal policy. Thank you very much.
John, it's Tom, and thank you so much
Hey,
for sharing your comments with us. Once again, I'm Tom Michaud. I'm a board member of the Foreign Policy Association, and just so delighted to be part of today's lecture. And thank you, Henry, as well for that wonderful introduction. I want to jump right into it. We've been collecting some questions from the audience, as well as I have some of my own. I wanted to, first of all, thank you for putting in front of us a plan about thinking about what happens when this pandemic is in the rearview mirror. That is going to happen one day. And I think it's important for us to be thinking about the right steps we need to take in our economy, for our country, and as you mentioned, our national security. As you laid out your plan, John, you talked about entitlement reform, I think, being that big step to go from the 30% to the 20% spending as far as GDP. What are, you think, some of the most economically wise steps that we can take with entitlements to adapt these programs so they'll still work for the country, but at the same time, maybe take a burden out of the equation that's necessary to release some growth?
It's a very good question, and I think more people need to understand that. But it's basically keeping the growth from going too high. It's keeping the growth down. So we're not talking about cutting, because people are retiring, people are getting old, there's also health issues. But it's mainly to keep the growth from rising. And to some extent, that's making sure the incentives are in the right place. I think there's various proposals out there at this point, and there's a huge amount of disagreement, as of course there is about just about everything in politics these days. But the key, and that's what we did in our calculations, is to slow the growth. And part of it is to give the right incentives to people so they use the healthcare efficiently or they retire at the right age. So I think the main thing is these are not cuts. These are slowing the growth. And the disturbing projections that we are seeing by CBO and others is that the spending on the programs is rising as a share of GDP and more rapidly than they can be and they should be. So that's the key at this point. It's not really rocket science so much as just doing something which is sensible when I think people look at it. But there's so much disagreement and projections are hard. You're looking at 10 years, 20 years, and people will say, well, what's the point of that? And I don't believe your model, and I don't believe this. So, but I think there can be more agreement about how to make these changes. And people have written about it. I've written about it, others too.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And also, as you went through your talk, you talked a little bit about debt to GDP, and seeing that this is the Pete Peterson lecture series, probably one of the most vocal proponents of fiscal discipline. How do you feel about debt to GDP? And when you look at where the United States could be headed today, you'll see us headed more and more towards that 100% territory of debt to GDP. And How does that, do you feel as if that's an important measure? Is it more of an observation? Is it more of a goal? And how do you feel about that measure? Because the markets seem to really focus on that one as important.
I think it is very important because the more debt a country has, the more you have to service it. So the more of public spending goes to interest on the debt rather than healthcare or defense. So it is very important. I think the numbers are even worse than what you said. It's like 140%. And the simulations, the calculations that we went through are to take it from 140 to something like 80. 80 is still a high compared to what it has been, but it's much more reasonable. So there's a question about whether we want to do that. I think it's important, partly because there's a crowding out. It means that the deficit has to be financed by other means, and that means there's more government borrowing and less private sector borrowing. Now there is a debate out there about, well, hey, interest rates are low. Why should we worry about this? Well, interest rates are not going to be low forever. The world still exists as it did. It may be somewhat lower than before, but this is tied into the discussion. People say, hey, the Fed is just charging 0 to 25 basis points, and the long-term treasuries are under 1%. Why do we need to worry about it? Well, we do because it's not going to always be that way. And history says that. Other countries show that. Right now, it's the case. So I would say it's time to take the action. There is another idea out there, which sometimes called modern monetary theory, MMT, and that is the idea: don't worry about the deficits because we can just finance them with money growth and producing a lot of money. And I don't think that's true either. Basically, you can't completely finance your deficits with money growth. Eventually, will cause huge amount of inflation or other distortions in the economy. And another idea is, hey, why not have negative interest rates? Maybe make it easier. But of course, that causes all distortions as well. And it's not clear that works very well. The Fed has shied away from that. The European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan have tried it. It's not, I think, with great results. So it's a complicated issue. But I think basically common sense prevails that if you have a large debt, other things are not going to change that much, and it's hard to service, hard to have to get the higher taxes to pay the interest on the debt, et cetera.
So, but it sounds like too that for benchmarking, you would be more focused on the spending as a percentage of GDP with a long-term view, rather than just benchmarking and sticking to the debt to GDP. Would it be your sense that growth over time would help bring that debt ratio down? Is that?
Yeah, I think as a society, we have to think about what the role of government is, how big it should be, and then once that's decided on, then finance it. Largely, it'll be through taxes. So if you want to have more defense, if you want rather than less defense, that has to be paid for. You want to have a good infrastructure program, roads and bridges, that has to be paid for. In the United States, of course, there's fiscal decentralization. A lot of spending, education in particular, is done at the state level. And so what kind of education system do you want to have? You might require more money. It might require a different system. So all those things, I think, are the basics. What kind of policy do you want to have at the government level? And that gets into huge questions. What should be done at the private sector? What should be done in the government sector? How much can be allocated to the private sector? So I think that's the first thing to think about. And then it should be financed. And then the decision about how to finance, it seems to me, you want to do that in the most efficient way possible. So you don't want taxes that discourage people from taking sensible actions. You don't want very high marginal tax rates, whether it's a low income or a high income, that discourages behavior. So you want to have the most, economists call it the neutral tax system possible. And that should go along with the government side. But the debt side should be smaller. Now, one other thing which I think is important to mention, especially now, is this idea that deficits sort of automatically increase in bad times. That's sometimes called automatic stabilizers. So during bad times, tax receipts go down and spending goes up. That's happening right now. But in good times, and that's part of what my analysis was about, when times get better, you want to make sure you go back to a situation where you don't have deficits. You even have surpluses, for example. And so on average, the budget deficit is zero, but it could be a deficit in a recession. It could be surplus in a boom.
John, do you see in the near-term horizon a strong impact from some of the difficult financial outlooks for some of the states around the nation? You mentioned that there's also debt in addition to the federal level. How do you feel the condition of the state finances right now factor into the equation with your plan, and what impact it might have overall? And do you think that we're going to need some crisis management in the next couple of years with regards to state finances?
It's a very good question. So my calculations in the lecture were federal. It's what the federal government needs to do is federal debt, federal taxes, but there is states, there's California, there's New York, et cetera, et cetera. And here I think there's a real issue, personally, that you could make a better tax system, you could make a better regulatory system, not just taxes, not just budget. And it's possibly a problem, and no question about it. I think that there's a danger now, and this has to do with incentives, and there's lots of discussion about this in the so-called second stimulus package, of how much the federal government should alleviate this problem. And my sense is the federal system works well because the decisions about taxes and government spending have been decentralized. And that puts the incentives in the right place. Now, sometimes, of course, people can say, well, let's not worry about it. We'll eventually be, and the word is usually used, bailed out. We'll be bailed out, don't worry about it. But I think that's not the kind of system to have in place. You should have the state of California or the Santa Clara County or Palo Alto or wherever you are in New York City, Brooklyn, whatever. You should have a system which works at that level. Now, of course, there can be problems. There can be emergencies. There can be particular harm to particular areas. And that's an issue that comes up now for sure. But for the most part, decentralized in a way that the incentives are in the right place. The incentives on the spending, the incentives on the taxes are in the right place. And it gets a little out of line. I was on a call earlier this morning where someone in Texas was telling me about all the companies and people that are moving from Illinois and California to Texas. And that's an issue. I don't know the data, but it's out there. I know people who have moved. And so that's about policy, it's about regulations. And so those are things that have to be put into place and thought about very clearly as well.
John, so someone has been around the Washington scene for a while and inside different administrations, the conversation that we're having right now seems so reasonable. And if there was an idea that we were going to sit down and we would say, we're not leaving this meeting until we get to an answer, I have to believe that the conclusion could be reasonable. But I don't get the sense that the budgeting, now, Grant, I know we're in the middle of a pandemic right now and we need to take strong measures, but what's your confidence level as someone who's passionate about this? Do you see any ground support for going back to a really logical conversation about the economy and having a broad-based plan? Because I think that there's been some turmoil, even preceding this administration, as how the whole Washington complex works around the budget. We don't even typically have a budget.
I think right now it's more contentious, more partisan than I've ever seen it in Washington. Been in and out of different governments, different points in time, back into the 70s, was in the military in the 60s. I think that there's more divisiveness now, and I don't know all the reasons for that. I think there's a tendency for people not to talk with each other, but just to have their own viewpoint and have less of a discussion. The idea of locking people in a room until they come up with an answer, we used to dream about that all the time, but there's always open doors, there's other alternatives, other places you can go. And I think that's what you're seeing right now, and people don't know exactly when to stop. I think that it's hardest in these bigger reforms. One example that's a little frustrating to me right now is we do see the pandemic having disparate effects on different people. And we want to deal with that. And to me, partially because I'm involved in education, I think a lot of it is is the K-12 system we have, and would like to see that change. But almost no one is talking about that, and it's because it's contentious and it's a union issue and personal lives. So I think we need to get to that. And same with taxes. Taxes are hard, they're complicated, so you can have all sorts of viewpoints that are coming up. But I have to say, this time seems the worst to me. You look on one channel, you get another view on another channel. There's much less of a let's hear both sides. People try to do that, but it seems to me not as much. Again, this is not the whole concept of partisanship is not unusual. It's the way we get things settled. We have argues, and there's eventually a compromise of some kind. Compromise, whether it's on taxes or on regulation or on military interventions. But I think that's something that we can all be trying to deal with. Get our viewpoints out there, make it clear as possible, but be willing to have a discussion and possibly be wrong sometimes.
Yeah, as you were speaking, you were reminding me of what I think was called the grand bargain, which was something
Yeah.
that was talked about, or whether it was the Simpson-Bowles effort to really try to get a multi-decade approach to fixing our fiscal outlook and putting some of these crises behind us. Let me
So actually, so I just interrupt. I think that's to some extent why in the lecture I've looked at this longer term thing that look, can't we, when we do this second stimulus package, if ever, can't we simultaneously talk about the next few years? What's so hard about that? And it's not that. And same with monetary policy. When we're debating the current, can't we also describe what's happening later? And in many respects, as someone who thinks about the economy as a place where people are looking forward, at least to some extent, making decisions about the future, that could be more important than people think. But it's hard to get people to pay attention to that when the immediate issues are in front of them.
So let's get to the monetary policy side of this. I think when you add it all up, the Fed's balance sheet is, let's say, $7 trillion. The Fed has been buying different types of assets during this pandemic. I think there have been some mild changes in Chairman Powell's statements, and like you said, it's gotten a little bit less specific, a little bit more vague. How quickly do you think the Fed should begin backing off and getting itself away for the influence it's had? Or do you believe that the Fed needs to remain very aggressive for where things are now? Is this going to be an issue in and of itself as the Fed begins to unwind the support that it's given?
Yeah, I think it's important for them to be thinking about what's next and more transparently. So just give you an example, in 2017, 2018, 2019, I think there was some pretty good progress at the Fed. There was talking about strategies and rules and ideas for setting the interest rate. It was published in their semi-annual monetary policy report quite actively. Many members were talking about that, was much research, but the COVID and the pandemic got off of that, and you can definitely see the difference. And so what I think will be important is to think about getting back to that. It worked well. As they say, our history shows the economy works well when you have a more strategic policy. And I would just maybe go back just a quick point. Back in the 70s, we had a terrible policy. Inflation rose, unemployment rose. And it wasn't until the late 70s, 80s that things changed, and they changed for the better because it became more systematic, more strategic, if you like, and that lasted. But I think it got off again with the 2007-8 crisis, and we're getting back on, and now this has thrown us off. So I think the sooner that we get on to the course that works, and again, let's not bemoan anything that's happened thus far, but let's try to get back, and I think that's possible to do. We've done it before. The sooner the better.
Mm-hmm. Let's switch to a couple of other topics. We've gotten some great questions from our audience, but what do you think about central bank digital currencies? And this month, I understand the Central Bank of the Bahamas is going to release my new favorite name of a currency, which is the sand dollar. And I know the Central Bank of China is talking about it. I know there's I believe, a joint study between the Fed and MIT right now on if there was a central bank of the United States backed digital currency. How do you feel something like that? Is that a game changer for the good, for the bad? How do you feel? How does it fall into our national security topic today? How does that fit into all that?
So I think it's good to have these discussions about digital currencies or alternative currencies. The only danger is you lose control of purchasing power, and it just gets away from the central banks completely. I think that's why central banks are so interested in it. In fact, they've been somewhat antagonistic about it because it looks like they would lose control. But I think it's frequently efficient. It enhances payments between countries, which is hard to do before. I've been very interested in it myself. It can reduce transactions costs. So I don't think it's a good idea for public policy to be stifling it. But if it creates control problems in the sense you can't control inflation, then be careful about that. And that could happen, obviously, if people use an alternative form of payment. It's not it can't be controlled in the sense of money growth can be controlled in the country, and that's important. So I've not been against the alternative people that are looking for it, the companies that have been set up, and MIT wants to do it, that's great. But I think the main thing is there's a purpose for monetary policy, and that's keep prices stable and the economy moving along at a steady pace. And you don't want to do something that disrupts that. So far, I haven't seen anything out there that disrupts it in terms of digital currency. So I'm more positive. I don't know about the sand dollar, though. I better look into that.
Yes, I thought, again, it's my favorite currency name now. So we got a great question from our online audience, which I thought I would ask you, which is, what do you think has driven essentially a multi-decade decline in interest rates, both in the United States and around the world? And what powerful forces is it that have driven that, in your opinion?
So it was first pointed out in the U.S. maybe about 20 years ago. Actually, John Williams, who's now president of the New York Fed, did some work on that. It had to do with the people wanting to save more. It drove the interest rates down compared to what it was originally. It had to do with the growth rate of the economy. That's another thing. If growth is slower, then the interest rate will be lower. So there's various hypotheses. I think most of them are just based on the data, based on what has happened. And you can look at interest rates and see that they've declined. Now, not everybody completely agrees that they've declined so much. And if you look at the data, this is, I think, important to point out. If you look at the data over a long period of time, of course, interest rates have come down as inflation's come down, because when you had double-digit inflation in the late 70s, you had double-digit interest rates. And when inflation came down, the decline in interest rate was part of that. So, but now it's more than that. And so you don't want to be confused between the two. The other thing I'd say is, of course, this pandemic has brought interest rates to near zero, and people are thinking about it should even be lower than zero. I think that causes distortions, and we should be very careful about that. Also, it could very well be that this lower interest rate reverses. And it's one reason I think the Fed should be studying this carefully, and other central banks as well. It's not true of all countries, by the way. It tends to be more global, but it's one of the most important things out there to get a handle on. And it's actually important. So I have one of the things I've done is have a little rule for what policy should be. And a part of that is deciding what the normal interest rate should be. And the normal interest rate I've always assumed was 2% real. If you had a total inflation target of 2, then it'd be 4% nominal rate on average. But many people think that the real equilibrium rate has fallen from 2 to 1 or a quarter, which means that the interest rate will not go back to 4, go back to 3 or 2 3/4. We'll have to see when the time comes, but it's very hard to tell at this stage in the cycle because the economy itself is depressed, and that keeps interest rates lower than they otherwise would be.
So we've gotten other questions that say that, by the way, they said, we don't want to ask John what interest rates are going to be. We'd actually like him to tell us, which I think there's a difference, which is quite a compliment to you, by the way. So you wrote in a recent Wall Street Journal op-ed that there were these thoughts that we were in a period of secular decline and stagnation, and that lower for longer was going to be the rule of the land for rates. Do you, just on a certainty level, I mean, I think you just said a little bit of it, but I'd like to really hear it specifically. Do you think the economic outlook is that if we go higher, we go a little higher, or are we going to be in a world where interest rates can still move a lot, or can move whether it's policy or markets demanding it? And maybe if you think about that, maybe in the next 3 to 10 years when you think of your outlook.
Sure. Well, this idea of secular stagnation has been part of the debate in recent years. And that generally means that, let's just face it, growth is low. It's going to be 1.5% or 2% rather than 3%. It's the way it is. Productivity is lower, or advancements are lower than they could be. So that's a view. I think that is a defeatist, and it's not true. I think, for example, productivity growth increased in the last few years as tax policy changed. I think that's of significance. So I don't want to throw out the idea that good economics can make growth higher. And it's productivity. Why is productivity growth what it is? Well, it has to do with regulations, has to do with taxes, has to do with inventions, has to do all sorts of things. So, but it shouldn't be viewed as something you can't affect. It's a very important part of policy. And if we forget that, I think what we're going to do is get lower growth. And secular stagnation people will say, well, I told you so. And they might be saying that anyway. Or they are saying that anyway. But I think the point is, if you have better policies, and that's regulatory, tax, international, all those things, you'll have higher growth. And by the way, when you have higher growth, you will have higher interest rates. And that's the way it is, because it's a higher growth rate than it otherwise would be. And maybe, again, if you take this idea of a normal 3%, let me put it this way, a normal 2% interest rate in real terms, and you stick with this target of inflation of 2%, then you're going to see a normal short-term average inflation rate of 4%. And that may be viewed as implausible. It used to be that way. It may be 3%. It doesn't really matter if it's 3%, as long as we know what it is. 3% just means that the policy will be adjusted to that a little bit. Now, if it's 0 or minus, that's a big deal. We have had thousands of years of history, which hasn't come close to that. And it's important to take in history into account as well here. History is you have thousands of years of interest rate data, and you don't see numbers with negative real interest rates.
That's remarkable that that you mentioned. I mean, this is a real experiment, right? This negative real interest rates. I mean, from the business I can tell you is it's causing tremendous damage to the European banking system, and there's absolutely, I think, a cost to the economy and the public for that. So there is an offset to whatever advantages policymakers, I believe, think that they're getting from negative interest rates. So I think it'll be interesting to see what the history books say about it down the road. As part of the talk about trade, and in the line again with what happens around the world in terms of government relations, how does globalization impact your views about all this policy making? And maybe I could even get so specific as you could say, gee whiz, we've just gone through this pandemic. We learned about, it wasn't even at wartime, we learned about how important ingredients in our supply chain weren't here in the United States anymore, whether it was in the pharmaceutical industry, or we need to make respirators or protective equipment for our countrymen. But how do you feel that globalization, and do you think that that whole movement slowed down? How does that impact? Should it be done wiser? Is it a really good thing? How do you feel as if this factors into all your thoughts?
So I think globalization is a good thing, because people who are in poor areas or are disadvantaged, they can learn and they can do better. And we've seen that so many places already. And I think so it's good. It's a good thing to do that. And you can spread the technology, spread the ideas. The danger, of course, is in this world, there are supply chains and there's security issues. And there's immigration issues, all sorts of things come into play. I think in this case, you want to look for alternatives that don't impinge or don't defeat the advantages of being global, the advantages of being able to learn how other people do things. Or I think, again, this gives an example. I've been so impressed by what's been happening recently. This, I guess we're partly using Zoom, partly YouTube here, but it's a tremendous benefit to people, and that's global. I think there's things that we could do to make it better. For example, maybe subsidize some internet purchases in areas or that are poor, or maybe that's something the World Bank or the IMF could do to help countries that aren't doing so well. It's really focusing on making things more global. We are in different parts of the country right now. I watched on YouTube Paul O'Neill and John Lipsky and others giving the lectures at Peter G. Peterson lectures series. They were all in New York. It was beautiful. I'm in California. You're in New York, but we're doing okay. And I think there's some changes. I mentioned I have a class of 350 students all over the world. And so that's changing things a lot. And I don't want to get in the way of that. That's in some sense globalization, right? Doesn't matter where you are. You have to worry about the time zone, but that's about it. And I think that's beneficial. Right now, I'm kind of worried that we're going in the reverse direction. There's people trying to restrict that, trying to prevent it from happening. And I think that the democracies and freedom to invent and do things, I call it economic freedom, are important to try to preserve. But there's efforts going in the other direction, from controls on where people go and what they do. And so we have to be particularly observant and make sure that we don't forget the good arguments for freedom.
Mm-hmm. And if there was, is there any advice that you would give and I know you've spoken a little bit more about longer term economic policies with the plan that you've proposed, but maybe even in the short term with regards to this pandemic and in the near term, and when you follow what's being talked about with the current stimulus bill for a second, or the conversation, I think taxes you've addressed, but even like with the stimulus, what's your sense about what would be the best move for the economy in the near term?
So I think the stimulus should be focused on people that are hurting. And what we've seen in past stimuluses is that the money has gone out and people just have saved it, haven't used it, and it's not very effective. Actually, that's true of the stimulus in 2007 and 2008, quite frankly, if you look at it carefully. So this has been different. It's been more focused on people. I think you need to design it properly. We're learned a lot about it. I hope the one that comes out is more targeted. There's debates about that. So that's one thing. But I would say it's very important not to just think about spending and taxes. Government does so many other things. The federal government, whether it's regulation, state governments, whether it's regulation, and then international trade. Those are things which are maybe more important for longer term growth and for improvements of living standards. If you look around the world's countries which have grown very rapidly, they're basically ones where they have removed controls and provided more opportunities for people, and that's worked. So I really worry going forward we're going to miss that, and we're going to think about it's easier to think about a government intervention than to emphasize the private sector. It's like my theme originally. You got economics, diplomacy, and military. Economics, in a way, is the hardest to get into the discussion. It's not as immediate. You can't see the cause and effect as well, but it may be the most important at all.
Mm-hmm. And then I think we have, thank you. And by the way, that is very important for the topic of what this lecture today is about. We have one time probably for one more question. We got another question in from our audience. What is your thought about all the implications of these policies that are out there now for the value of the dollar? Or do you think the value of the dollar is something that government's going to focus on trying to keep within a range, whether it's monetary policy or otherwise? But do you see any big moves where you think the dollar around the world could be.
Yeah. I think the main concern with currencies is monetary policy. So there's, of course, a higher interest rate would make the currency stronger. A low interest rate will make it weaker. And if you want a weaker currency, it's going to be good for exporters. And so there'll be a tendency to have monetary policy generate a lot about that. You've seen many arguments about that. During the so-called quantitative easing episodes, began in the US, the Japanese followed because they didn't want their currency to be so strong. So I think the main thing is to have an international monetary system. I think of it as rules-based, which doesn't try to influence the exchange rate. If you choose to have a fixed exchange rate, like the Europeans have done so with their euro, then that's fine. Then you realize you're not going to have a separate central bank. And but if you have a different currency like the dollar versus the euro, then it's important to have your policy, again, emphasizing inflation being low, or steady at least, and also in the economy doing well. And the exchange rate will be flexible, and that's okay as long as there's not a lot of intervention. One of my stints in Washington was the Treasury on currencies, and I really thought it'd be better if we didn't intervene. So it was a big push to have less intervention. And I think that worked well. It goes against a lot of thinking because, hey, if I buy a lot of dollars, I have a lot of money in the Treasury, and I can move the currency. It seems pretty good, but it's generally not a good idea to do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. John, what a treat today has been to hear your thoughts about your plan, as well as to your answers to some of the questions about the plan and just the way you see the world at the moment. And it's been really terrific to have you as our guest. And on behalf of the Foreign Policy Association, I'd like to thank all of our viewers. And once again, John, this was terrific. And thank you and all the best to you.
Thank you, Tom. It was great. I enjoyed every minute. It was beautiful. Thanks for your questions.
Thank you.